The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Design for Fingers, Touch, and People, presented by Stephen Hoober of Fourth Mobile and hosted by Bestica, Inc. My name is Ashreen Momin, and my producer here is Ross Diaz. Many thanks to the team at Bestica and Mr. Harvinder Singh, our President and CEO, for inviting Stephen to join us today. Bestica has strong ties to the UX recruiting community. Please feel free to reach out to our recruiters, Melanie, Carlos, and Kat. They're amazing at matching candidates with organizations. You can find them on our Bestica UX community or through LinkedIn. If you're an organization looking for a candidate, feel free to call, visit the Bestica website, or email our recruiters. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. You are all muted, but you will have the opportunity to submit a question to today's presenter by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. We will collect these and address them after the presentation. I would now like to say a little bit about Stephen. Stephen Hoober wrote the book on mobile design patterns and is best known for his ongoing research into how people really use touchscreen phones and tablets. He is a self-described reform unicorn who has been a database analyst and front-end developer, but has focused on designing for mobile and multi-channel products since 1999, designing the first Google mobile search, the first mobile app store for Sprint, mobile browsers including parts for Samsung browsers, websites like weather.com and Lowe's Home Improvement, and apps for companies like Hallmark, US Bank, and Cummins Diesel. Stephen maintains a repository of mobile designs and development information, including all the content from the O'Reilly book, Designing Mobile Interfaces at the Fourth Mobile Patterns Wiki, regularly writes for UX Matters magazine and UX magazine, among other writing and speaking engagements. Now, let's welcome Stephen.
Thanks very much. You and probably everybody on the phone own a smartphone, and you use it all the time to browse the web, have a bunch of favorite apps, and because you use it so much, you think you understand how everyone uses their phone. But you're probably wrong. We're bad at self-analyzing and self-reporting, and there's a lot of rumor and misunderstanding out there about how all these things work. This matters because the normal computer is no longer a desktop with a keyboard and a mouse, but a touchscreen smartphone or tablet. Now, pens as pointing devices predate the mouse by decades, although when they started they looked like big weird gun things. But by the late 1960s, we're actually in use in business for real work in ways that it would be familiar to you today. Here, she's dragging across a selection of text to copy it in the 60s. Touchscreens, actually using your finger instead of a pen, have been around almost as long and have actually been in consumer products like this car since the 1980s. So how do we still fail to use them properly so very much of the time? How do we fail to design them to be easy to use so much of the time? Because we use old knowledge, and we keep trusting it without validation. I still see people saying that touch targets have to be 22 millimeters wide to accommodate the size of people's fingers. International standards say so, and they're always right, right? It's also because we rely on technology and trust our overlords even when we should know better. So Apple said 44 pixels once, and we keep saying that even though 44 pixels is a different physical size on different devices. But my finger doesn't change sizes very often. And because it takes time for products to get into the mainstream. Touchscreen smartphones were around 10 or 15 years before Apple invented them. But we don't have to think and assume. We can know for real now. Remember how we hate being confused with UI designers, or even worse, with artists? Because we don't just go with opinion and gut instinct. We base our decisions on information, on user behavior, on science. A couple years ago, I had a gut instinct problem here, and I started researching again. Couldn't find what I wanted, so I grabbed a clipboard and observed over 1,300 people on the street, in the train and bus, in coffee shops, and so on, in several countries, using their smartphones. I did meta-research, reading dozens of reports on touch and gesture, and finding 19 with good enough data to actually pull in, normalize, and correlate to my own. All of these agreed, by the way, with each other. My favorite one of them had over 120 million recorded touch events, so this is very statistically valid stuff. In concert with the e-learning guild, I got another 651 observations in schools, offices, and homes. Adding even more data on tablets and reconfirming our data on phone use. A little more recently, I did a combined intercept and remote unmoderated test to get data how people use touch based on the types of input and tasks they're trying to perform. And now there's a lot more touch research carrying on with this. We're getting usage data from other countries, from other types of devices, gathered in different ways, and as people do weird things like carrying around their shopping. We have the data, and now we need to start applying it. We know how to design for people, and for the many devices people use, not just iPhones and iPads. We know how to design for hands, fingers, and thumbs. So, instead of boring you for 8 or 10 hours talking about this, I've tried to boil it down into 10 user behaviors and the accompanying guidelines you can understand to make your designs work for touch and people in the real world. It's easy to make assumptions and confuse empathy with your own point of view. Your users are not like you or your friends. And oddly enough, neither are you. As I said at the beginning, we're bad at observing ourselves. Never trust surveys about any of this when you can get observations instead. Everyone assumes that all phones are still small iPhones, grasped with one hand and tapped only with a thumb. But that's simply not true. It's seriously not true that people use tablets with one hand, so no more saying that the back button or menu button in the top left corner is simply evil. And without going too much into it, that's because of physiology. Your thumb simply doesn't work the way Josh Clark and a bunch of others think it does. People adjust instead. They hold phones in multiple ways. They shift their grip to reach other areas of another finger, to type with two thumbs. They move to cradle the device to get more reach. So as I said, they hold phones in multiple ways, depending on their device, their needs, and their context. And they do it without knowing, which also means you can't observe yourself well enough to predict that. So to numbers, 75% of users only touch the screen with one thumb. True, but that can be misleading, because fewer than half hold the phone with one hand also. That's just for phones, much less than for phablets and tablets, of course. Instead, 36% cradle the device, as I just showed you, using a second hand to give you more reach or for more stability in difficult environments. And fully 10% hold it in one hand and simply poke it with the other finger, a totally different kind of interaction than any thumb sweep range things. While you're here, more data I get asked about. About 60% of the time, mobile devices are used in portrait, 40% landscape, but that's for all device classes. It changes as you go up in size. Tablets are used much more in landscape. 65% of the time, a 9 or 10-inch tablet is used, just laying horizontally. So I still design everything to work in all orientations on all devices. 84% touch the screen with their right hand. Not nearly enough to assume all users use their right hand, so design for both. And annoyingly, the distribution doesn't match the percentage of left-handers in the population, from which you can determine the world is confusing. I can't explain why that happens. But I can tell you most people also switch hands a lot during a single session. Tapping with one hand, switching to the other one to scroll. Don't know why. We have enough data now that we can start looking at things like age, sex, region, and find no perceptible changes. But if you have some very specific type of application, there's insufficient data gathered maybe to say there isn't some preference, so go get your own. And overall, remember to design for multiple contexts and for switching between them. Don't assume anything or try to force your users into any one method. Because the more I watch people, the more I'm amazed at how variable their interactions are, how they're comfortable changing their hand position, how they touch the screen in different ways to do different things with their devices as they change tasks and context. So much of the data I've gathered allows us to chart these use patterns, like I already showed you. We're starting to understand how the way people hold devices changes by context. So hardly anyone holds their phones with 2 thumbs on the screen, unless they're typing, when it jumps up to 41% of the use. Now eventually I hope we get even more information like this and we can start making design decisions based very specifically on input type and the user context. But for now, design for every user for the variable ways they work with their devices, whichever device they choose to use. Users, in general, for every portable touchscreen device, prefer to touch the center of the screen. We keep reconfirming this. What you're seeing here is the actual data from one of my studies. These are the tap positions when users selected items from a full-screen scrolling list. They were free to move the scroll to selection, so they naturally moved the content to the position they wish to view and tap it. Then we recorded that. This also reflects other data on tap accuracy and preference we'll talk about later. When you account for content position in different devices, you find most taps are in about the center half of the page or so. If you wonder about tablets, they're surprisingly similar. That data is actually embedded into this visualization. There's essentially no difference. So you might think when you copy the UI for something like this, the key controls and actions are the input at the top and the bottom of the viewport. But in fact, the primary content and interactive area is that big scrolling list in the middle of the page. All of these content-centered tools are already based around the user's primary behavior of viewing and tapping the center of the viewport. The other functions, the tabs, the action buttons, the menu bar at the bottom, are secondary options. Google, with its current design methodology, is giving us another way to get controls to the center of the screen. You can bring the functional buttons off the edges towards the middle of the screen, floating in the top, like Android Material Design allows you to. Here, the direction and center buttons are not hidden along the very edge or behind a menu, but kind of in the middle of the page where they can be useful. If that's not enough, we keep getting new research to prove it out. This more recent study is the time it took to tap on various little squares on an iPhone 5 screen while holding it in that classic one hand and thumb mode. Even here, the center is faster, corners are worse, and there's no indication of sweep ranges. Because it's time to tap accurately, and people were observed missing and retrying, it also shows accuracy by zones. I'll mention that a little bit more later. So even though it seems to be subconscious, or maybe it's learned over time, users prefer to touch the center of the page and will do so when they're given a choice. Therefore, give them that choice. Place the key actions in the middle half to 2/3 of the screen, and place options and secondary paths along the top and bottom of the screen. Don't worry about how far anyone can reach with one hand, even on bigger phones and tablets. People will shift their grip to reach the secondary actions along the edges, even in the farthest corner, without complaining. Conveniently, this extends to viewing as well. Just keep following the existing, reliable mobile pattern of list views or grid views and put your main content and interaction in the middle of the page. Make sure menu bars, tabs, and status displays and action items on the top and bottom are secondary. If you have content that scrolls and takes up the whole page, and of course we all do, you need to make sure the bottom of your scrolling articles and forms are padded so users can bring the last line of text or that last form field toward the middle of the page. Otherwise, they'll still try and waste time and be that little bit more dissatisfied. And please avoid this somewhat trendy way of showing pages that snap to the viewport. so you can't really scroll. People don't read like that. So even if it isn't tappable, make sure key content is in the middle of the page. Sometimes this means providing extra room or other provisions to let users scroll longer content to the middle of the viewport. As I said earlier, but briefly, finger size doesn't matter. And it's true, but only for touch target size and touch accuracy. But fingers are opaque. They get in the way. This one's anecdotal and getting a little old too, but I've seen similar results on real projects. When I updated to a version of Twitter a while ago, I kept hitting the add person icon. Not just because I focused on the middle first, not just because that icon has got this nice inviting plus symbol, but because the compose area down here is obscured by my thumb as I naturally scrolled through the content. I simply missed it while glancing around at the actual tweets in the middle of the page. So where are our fingers on the screen? Well, it depends what we do and how we grasp. I used to tell you specifically not to put items below or to the side or whatever, but it's hard to do that due to the many ways people shift their grip. We simply need to instead provide room to make sure that people can see the target, see the label, and see the clicked state when the target is selected. When you tap a whole row, and especially one multiple lines long like this, that works great. Little icons like the retweet are too small, so the user can't accurately target them, can't confirm which one is selected, and can't see that the selected state changed on tap, so can't be sure they tapped at all. In some contexts, we know even better what users do. For example, this is where people scroll, which is interesting, but why are there three distinct areas? Because they have to do with what content is being displayed. Here, the content was a list with very small amounts of information, so there are large blank areas in the middle of the screen. Remember, users prefer to touch the center. Get used to that coming up over and over again. So all other things being equal, people want to touch and look at the center of the screen. Yes, there are outliers, and I included all the data, but most users were gesturing in the middle. But here, where there were fairly long pieces of content that ran more to the side of the screen, users did most of their scrolling to the right. Even left-handed users were more inclined to avoid touching the content so reached across the screen. Someone shared with me that they have similar observations with the Arabic language apps they build, just reversed. It's a right to left language. Blank spaces to the left are used for scrolling and gesturing. Reason is users aren't confident scrolling in areas where there are items or content they want to see or worry they will interact with. When the page is simply full of content and there's no room, they still choose to scroll to the far right side, or left for Arabic and Hebrew, or near the bottom to try to get away from the content. Yes, this varies a bit based on device size. On tablets, your content might be shorter, so there's more room. Here I've normalized the data to the handset so you can compare it more directly. You might think users would stick to the edges on tablets because they're bigger. Of course people can't reach the center, but you're wrong. People are always inclined to tap the center of portable touch devices. So when room is available to confidently scroll without covering content, they'll move their finger, thumb, or stylus over towards the center of the screen, even if it's a reach or requires repositioning their finger or their device. So make sure people can see content around their fingers and thumbs. Make sure selectable items are large enough to clearly indicate when a tap is successful. Try to place functions in the content that changes so users can see the results, or to invite them to perform actions you think are important. And think about what users are clicking or scrolling on. White space, or as I do it, black space, may be really important to give them confidence to gesture amongst your content. Stop saying fragmentation as though it's a bad thing. Instead, start respecting user choice. There are many devices. They're all different because people's needs are different. This is reflected not just in their choice of buying, but in the way the devices are used. We think of our typical smartphone as being held around 12 inches or 30 centimeters from the eyes, and of course when walking around. Otherwise you'd use a computer. But phablets, and something like half of smartphones sold now have screens over 5 inches, are used a little more when sitting down. And tablets are used almost 2/3 of the time in a stand or set down on tables. Large tablets like 9 and 10-inch iPads are used about 1/4 of the time with physical keyboards, with the screen almost arm's reach away, and almost 10% with pen styluses. Yes, that thing underneath the screen is a pen. In general, the smaller the device is, the more it's used on the move. Now, on the move doesn't mean in buses or on trains, but can just mean when you walk around the house or office. Instead of finding time to stop and use that tablet on the table or sit and type on a computer at your desk. As devices get larger, they're used less and less held in the hand. All in all, this means that distance from the eye can be surmised by device class. This is critical partly because we don't view anything based on the size, but on the resolution at our eyeballs. The relationship between these two is called angular resolution, which we can calculate. This is actually the simple version of this formula. To get to the 3,438 number requires knowing the wavelength of visible light and the size of the little sensors in your eyeballs. But don't worry about writing down this number and calculating it. I've done the math for you. The larger devices get, the further away from the eye they're used, like I said. So small handsets held very close to the eye, larger ones in tablets further away, and tablets pretty much at desktop distance, since so many are in stands with keyboards. Minimum text sizes, therefore, vary from 4 points for small handsets to 10 points for devices set on tables or in stands. Yes, this does depend on the actual context, but we can make very good guesses based on device class. And remember, these are minimum sizes, at least 30% larger for all actual uses like buddy copy. Of course, larger for more readability, for active environments, and for older or other populations who can't read as well. Icons and other elements follow the same scale rules and can roughly follow these actual sizes. They have the same concerns of readability as text. Let's dive into type a little more while we're here. Beyond sizes, the other critical thing which we face, which is not face, but contrast. I like to pretend mobiles are used 100% by people with vision issues. They're colorblind, nearsighted, etc. This way we have to use the best of the WPAG recommendations, the AAA standard. If these seem stringent, they're not. I use mostly white on black, which is a 23:1 contrast ratio. If you care, I do black backgrounds instead of white to reduce total light output. And then you don't have to adjust the screen brightness as much. You can use it in full light and full darkness and it's still readable. But of course your brand of your app or site matters a lot, so black backgrounds might not work for you. But back to sizes. I told you the minimum sizes and said you should use those rarely. These are the sizes I suggest as your baselines for normal text. You don't have to try to screenshot this. I have an entire article about that where I have the chart available to you. If you can't find it, you can always ask me later and I'll give it to you. I really do use the minimum sizes, though, for labels under icons and captions and so forth. Basic content is good for normal descriptive text, enhanced content for introductory text, key values in tables, subtitles, and so forth. And as it shows here, you can add to that with a whole hierarchy of sizes. Now, if you only need one headline size, skip the H1 and H2 shown here. Your title is the H3 size. This is just kind of an example guideline with the minimum size changes required to make it all make sense. So, support all input types, especially if you're building responsive websites or expect to make an app for both tablet and handset. That means support touch, pen, and keyboard, navigation, and entry. If you can, get data on how your users work in their actual environment. But for most users, the patterns I outlined are pretty safe, and you can predict size and use by device class. Account for distance by adjusting the sizes of readable items like type, icons, text fields, checked boxes, and buttons. People are never going to be able to precisely click your target. There's simply always inaccuracy, but you can account for it in design. You remember how we discussed earlier that touch doesn't know how big your finger is, and how it just gets a point at the center where you touched. But that point is never, ever perfectly aligned. There's no such thing as perfect accuracy. the user misses a little always. Accuracy is relative, and it can be defined as something called the circular error of probability, or CEP, which is just a mathematical representation of how much you miss on average. Here I use the R95 measure, or the radius containing 95% of taps. When everything is imprecise, we stop calling these misses and errors and refer to tolerances instead. We can simply plan for imprecision and problems as part of the process. We do that by providing the largest practical touch targets. Don't just code a word or an icon as a link, but like this phone-based payment scheme, use natural boundaries in your design, boxes, buttons, whole rows, as the selectable or linked area. Tap anywhere nearby that word or icon, and you hit the target. Look around a little, and you'll see this is known best practice. Usually, though they sometimes mess it up, the Google drawer menu isn't as small as it appears, with just the little arrow or menu icon. A default implementation also opens it on selecting the label or the branding, so it's much easier to tap than it appears to be. Sometimes Android messes it up, and lots of hybrid apps don't notice this and code it wrong, so you have to hit exactly that little back arrow. But if you build it like this, people don't even notice that you've made it easier for them. They tap, thinking that they're trying to hit the arrow, they hit somewhere else, and they can go back with no problems. I've thrown out a bunch of words there, and I talked about it all individually, but it's all happening right on top of each other. Try not to get confused by all the words I'm throwing out, especially when they're things like centroid or CEP. Just remember that real users work with your touch interface in the real world. Make touch targets as large as possible using entire containers, such as rows, boxes, and buttons, not just icons or words. Don't design little details or retrofit touch design to a mouse-driven design. Make your design touch-centric at the grid and template level to provide enough room and the right kind of interactivity. So touch isn't just inaccurate, but it's inconsistently inaccurate. And what's most interesting is that the largest variable is not environmental conditions, familiarity with touchscreens, or anything else. It's the position on the screen the user is trying to tap. This is a chart of the accuracy of touch on various devices, aggregated over very large numbers of individuals. Black is more accurate. From this, we can start seeing how accurate people are and how it varies by section of the screen. We know, as I've said already, really, that people are more accurate in the middle of the screen. And we mean pretty much any screen, any way they hold their phone or tablet. They also seem to subconsciously know this, or maybe it's tied to the preference for reading in the middle. So they're more confident of the center. They'll slow down when they tap corner or edge targets. If we map all that data differently, we can see how much more room is needed between items in various parts of the screen. The sides are a little worse than the center, but the top and bottom require much more room. And corners are simply the worst. I think these neatly correspond to the sort of structural zones that already exist in much of our designs. Think of the rows you already designed to, with mastheads, tabs, the big content area in the middle, and the chyron of buttons or other functions at the bottom of the screen. You can design by zones, spacing selectable items to prevent interference based on how well people touch parts of the screen. You can almost get away with simply remembering this tip as avoid the corners instead. You don't have to memorize every single subsection. Just remember edges and corners have less accuracy. When you put items here, space them further apart. Use fewer tabs and menu bar items. And remember the sides are a bit worse, so avoid actions that take place only at the left or right ends of a list. Take advantage of the natural middle selection preference and improved accuracy. Whether you check digitally or, as I'll mention later, with real-world tools, you measure space between centers. Center the size target in the tappable area, and if anything else is in the circle, that has a chance of being tapped by accident. So those top icons are just a bit too close together. And the tabs, as is common, are far too short. So you could tap the action buttons or a tweet in this list by accident. As I mentioned earlier, the icons in the middle of the page are small, but most important is that missing them selects the tweet for viewing. Let's assume here this is done as a tactic. If interference is likely, designed for resilience, so the user can make do, but never so there's an unrecoverable condition. Email format controls, for example, should never be right next to the send button, as I'm sure many of you know. Remember, send doesn't sound catastrophic. It's not like delete, but it's unrecoverable. Once you've accounted for interference, you want to design not to annoy. Things like this, where you try to click the link and instead open the reply dialog, are not a catastrophe, but they could be better. There hasn't been a lot of data on how we use tablets traditionally, till fairly recently, when I went out and got my own as part of this latest round of research and was able to confirm these same pointing accuracy levels apply to 7, 8, and 10-inch tablets as well. That people click most accurately in the center, a little less well on the sides, and notably less well on the top and bottom of the screen, and especially in the corners. The test app we used for this was hybrid and poorly built. With the default target sizes, that meant many users couldn't select this menu button on handsets or tablets as a result. Hence, we got lots of taps trying to whack on the button. Not all of them that worked. So remember to design by zones, spacing selectable items to prevent interference based on how well people touch parts of the screen. The sides are less accurate than the centers, so if you use lists, avoid things like putting delete or select only along the left or right side. If you have to do this, pick your vertical list spacing from the side accuracy, not the center. When you do put things in the middle and follow these guidelines strictly, you can get away with quite dense information, whether it's closely spaced lists or small selectable areas in pretty much any kind of layout. When you place controls along the top or bottom, use as few items as possible and space them out. The Android action button spacing is too tight, so loosen it up. More than 4 items in an iOS menu bar is usually just asking for trouble. And remember to plan for interference. Space unrecoverable or even annoying to exit items farther from others, and provide undo features and so forth. I still get clients asking for Easter egg level hidden gestures, with the theory being that users having to explore your app to find the neat features is delightful. Sure, you can add those if you want, but start with, always have a fallback to, what works. Simple controls that work in expected ways. And the most expected controls are those that are visible and communicate what they will do. Make sure selectable items are clearly selectable. I haven't done a study specifically about this, but I'm seeing enough observations on other research and for usability studies for clients I'm comfortable saying what seems obvious. If it doesn't look clickable, people don't know it is. Underlines aren't bad for text inline on websites, but especially for apps you mostly need to bound items. That doesn't mean everything has to be a bold box or a gradient button like in the olden days. Here, little translucent backgrounds in the menu and controls and a sort of circular tab strip in the middle suffice to define them as functions. I'm starting to see that any bound item is considered selectable. If some visual designer had come back and boxed the title element for visual consistency, people would assume they can tap it to get more details. You can't, so this is better. The clickable functions are differentiated by a distinct style and combined with a few typical items like the play icon clearly say these are clickable functions, as opposed to the others, which are just information. Clickable items need to not just afford their action, making it clear what they do, but to do so consistently. I would love someone at Google to tell me why my calendar name, attendance, and the participants are selectable rows, but the location is a link. And not just styled like a link, but an actual link. I have to click exactly where the link is, not just anywhere in the location row. We'll never know why they did this, but don't do it yourself. Be consistent and make whole contained areas, rows and boxes, selectable. That's what people expect. Visual targets, whether they're words, icons, or some other shape or UI widget, must attract the user's eye, be drawn so the user understands they are actionable elements, be readable so the user understands what action they will perform, and be large and clear enough the user is confident he can easily tap them. Follow the size rules I already showed you per device class. If you use gestures that involve dragging from off-screen, or even just targets right against the edge of the screen, you might be forgetting about raised bezels, because phones are flat, right? Well, no. Plenty of them have a raised bezel to protect the screen, and many, many, many users put cases on their phones. What this means is that many users cannot actually get to the edge of the screen. If they really press their finger, they can get skin on the edge, but remember, the screen senses the center of your contact area. It's going to think the user is touching around here somewhere instead. Avoid edge gestures, or just provide plenty of padding so they work with all your users, even those with a case. Remember that people use their phones in real environments and interact with them just as they do with anything else. We can't think that people just interact with a flat glass screen in a sterile environment. We talked about how people shift their devices, but they shift them depending on not just the device, the input that's necessary, or the position of the screen, but on their context. I've observed people changing the way they're holding their phone when opening a door, carrying groceries, carrying a baby, walking down the street, walking in difficult terrain, or even just stepping off a curb, riding in a moving train or bus, especially when they're standing and trying to use their phone, or in some perceived dangerous context, walking in the wind near the edge of a cliff. People adapt to their situations, but they do suffer consequences. Simply carrying a bag of groceries reduces accuracies in shocking and unexpected ways. Some recent research explored the effect of trying to carry other objects while walking and using the phone. Using the phone with one hand and carrying a shopping bag in the other can reduce touch accuracy in the most distant corner of the screen by 30 millimeters. As you see here, that's huge. Remember, I argue for gigantic 10 to 14 millimeter targets in the corners. Others tell you that you only need 7 or 9 millimeters, so 30 is a lot. People missing targets by a factor of 6 has not even occurred to us before this. Think about how that's going to affect your design when people miss the targets and click the wrong thing. So if you want to place items right against the edges or have edge gestures, go ahead. But don't only allow them to work 1 pixel from the edge originating off screen. Provide some padding. The safe zone here is around somewhere between half and the full width of the accuracy by zone. Along the sides, I use 6 to 8 millimeters, but for the top and bottom, I extend this to 10 to 12. If it's important to your product that edge gestures work, test it with the most intrusive case you can find. Size guidelines like I keep giving you are fine, but you can help yourself a lot and reduce your time doing math by just checking your work at scale. Get the design out of Graphel, Visio, Axure, Photoshop, InDesign, or whatever, and get it off the computer. There's no desperate need for clever prototype tools, though things like Get Launcher Pop-App do work. Just put the screens into the device gallery. Draw on paper. Put your designs in the phone whenever you can. Carry the phone outside and actually tap on the screen. How it works and looks on the real device is very different from how it looks in Photoshop on your computer. When you're ideating, bring device templates to sketch on and devices, so everyone cannot just wave their arms but try out your product and show examples of others right there in the room. Sketch a device scale, so you start with it being the right size. If you're sketching out phone screens in a full-size piece of paper, then you're doing it wrong. Phones are small. Get it off your computer and get it out of PowerPoint when you're demoing things too. Try it out. Pass it around the room to make sure you aren't foolish, or to share the design the way it will really work when you're meeting with clients or stakeholders. Now here, everybody's facing the same way because I also have a PowerPoint deck to guide them, but we're passing around a phone so everybody knows what it's actually going to look like. That big red bar at the top of the screen might be screaming at you in PowerPoint, but work great on the phone. Keep doing this for any devices. Visit or simulate real environments. Here we drove down the street to a store where there were trial kiosks with iPads. Later it was something completely different. So this was totally a prototype. Are people using it in trucks, in auto repair shops, in mines in Brazil, or village clinics in Africa? You can't really tell how well your design is going to work from your cubicle in the financial district or a usability lab. You have to get out to those sites or at least simulate them as best you can. Disappointingly, we can't solve all problems as app and web designers and developers. For example, there are scale issues involving the way that device-independent pixels and viewport scaling works. The key issue is that the OS makers and device manufacturers hear nothing but your cries of fragmentation and try to simplify to as few scales as possible. But that also means they lie. They group items into a fairly small number of categories. Yes, even Apple. Well, actually, maybe especially Apple, as there's no good way around the in-device scaling the iPad mini or iPhone 6 Plus use. Even if you got good size specs, the variability in the scale between devices means your text, icon, or touch target could be a bit larger or quite a bit smaller than you planned on. So let's say you make a button 7mm tall to assure people can click it and nothing else. Set it to the correct size in device-independent pixels, and when it gets to real phones, it could be as small as 5mm. This is often going to be intolerable, when your intended size is far below useful. Or it could be so large that nothing fits in the screen of that small phone with a low-res screen. Paper continues to be the best way to design and keeps being our friend by working at any scale we want. Remember to try your work on real devices as soon and as often as possible. It doesn't have to be real code to put on a phone. It doesn't even have to be a real drawing. Take a photo of the whiteboard, crop it, and stick it on the phone. If it still makes sense on the phone screen, you're doing well. Plan to design everything about 20% larger to account for undersized targets and type. This is often safe anyway, and I sometimes say 30% larger for users in worse environments with bad eyesight, etc. Look at the devices your users actually have. Do the math and find out how bad it is and adjust a bit for follow-on releases if it is a problem. It seems like a lot when you see it on the list, but just remember the core features of these 10 points. Put content and functions in the middle of the screen. Design with fingers in mind so users can see around them. Design by zones with bigger touch targets along the edges and corners. Place touch items to avoid catastrophe when people miss targets. Be consistent in how you design interfaces and interactions. And always respect people, their device choices, their patterns of use, and their contexts. Within what you can control, just always remember to design for hands, fingers, thumbs, and people. You can get a summary of this deck and of all the articles I've written and referenced at forth.com/touch. If you don't want to ask a question today, you can contact me later to discuss this more. Visit my site for a lot of tips and tricks and guidelines, and even a free way to access this book, which isn't only in Chinese. Or you can bug me over Twitter to ask questions later, or through any of these other methods you see available. My username is the same almost everywhere.
Thank you. Stephen will now answer questions about today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the question pane in your attendee control panel. How about the burger menu? Some mobile sites/apps have it on the left side, others on the right. Which option is more clickable?
I actually did do a specific research to test that one out and found exactly no difference between them. This is another one where, since I write a regular column, I have an entire article about why the hamburger menu isn't evil, but only, of course, like all patterns, if you use it right. Of course, if you hide the primary functions behind it, it doesn't work well, but if you use it for tertiary functions, as we talked about today, primary stuff's in the big list in the middle of the page, secondaries are on the buttons at the top and bottom of the screen, but one of those can be a menu that gives you tertiary or backup functions. And then it simply does not matter if it's on the left or the right side, in my experience. that one I showed you on the tablet where it just said menu and a big button on the right side, that was because we randomized it. We had it both, showed it to different people. Some got the right, some got the left, and it always worked. To extend that, in usability testing I've done for clients, I have items in a menu that are on the right, which everybody seems to think is crazy, but it works for various good reasons having to do with not interfering with the back button and stuff. And literally 100% of all users we've ever tested can handle it. They always find it. And by all users, I mean things like people with no phone. Not no smartphone, no mobile phone at all, no computer at home, and they rarely use a computer in the office. So I'm pretty confident about saying those kind of functions work. People get very used to digital devices very rapidly, and they start understanding that if a function is expected, then it's probably there somewhere, and it might take them 30 seconds, but they'll eventually click through and find it.
Early in the presentation, you talked about the number of observations you've collected. What tools or methods do you use to collect those observations?
Oh boy, that's another one I can go on and on about. So the data I'm sharing here, I did a lot on pencil and paper. Eventually I got tired of carrying around a big clipboard because I wanted to be able to do the observations ad hoc, like while traveling in an airport. It was hard to whip out a clipboard while I'm standing in the checkout line, so I made a little, what did I use? Not SurveyMonkey. I cannot remember what I used, but I used somebody's little digital data collection tool that gave me a web form. So as long as I had an internet connection, I could quickly record the information. The other one I did is, for the context stuff, I use video glasses. It's surprisingly manual because digital data collection technologies kind of don't exist. You have to write custom code for that, and I'm not that kind of developer. But I got some spy glasses, for lack of a better word, off of Amazon, cooked them apart, modified them so the lens points more downward to where the way people look. If you didn't know that, people don't look straight forward when they're using their phone. Straight forward is kind of their eyes, and they look down like 30 degrees at their phones when they're using them. So I had to modify the camera to look down at those, and then I recorded everything, and then I used, I can't remember the name of it again, a tool, which if it's really important you can ask me later, that lets you put scaled measuring tools on your screen. So in the video capture tool, we recorded the actual points manually, and had to measure the sizes to get scales and stuff like that. To keep ranting though, for usability testing, I do pretty much everything kind of the same way. I haven't done a lab study for years, literally like 4 or 5 years. I do everything, well, a little bit remote, unmoderated, but almost everything else using ethnographic techniques. Go out to visit people in the street doing intercepts, or in shops where they work, or offices where they work. And so we end up doing having to use a lot of the same techniques. Paper usually, because it's easier, forms, and video cameras to record sticking in your pocket to record roughly what's happening, and video glasses to record what they're doing from their point of view, because especially on mobile phones, it's often hard to tell what they're looking at or what they're touching from you looking over their shoulder. So the video glass things helps a lot to later on figure out what was the actual problem.
How does designing for AAA accessibility impact the touch zone?
I think not at all. The WCAG recommendations are very, very web-centric and very, very old web, meaning they can assume a desktop computer with a keyboard and mouse. If there are touch guidelines that are there for them, you need to yell at me about that later. Send me a tweet or an email or something, and I will look into it because I'm not aware of them. As far as I know, I have the most stringent touch guidelines available. So if you and we have covered a large range of use cases, like walking on the street, and a large range of users. So we seem to have pretty good coverage of, say, people with people of all type, all use levels. So that should cover pretty much everything I'm aware of. I'm probably skipping up. Probably not saying that clearly enough, but anyway, I'm not aware of any specific guidelines for touch for accessibility to make sure you can cover absolutely every user type, sadly. It would be cool to get that, though.
Is there any hard and fast rule that says that people will give up on an app after a certain number of times trying to perform an action and failing to get the desired result?
No, but I hear it a lot. Very frequently we get the marketing guys repeating that 3 clicks and they're out, or any other numbers like that. These are always, in my experience, can be traced down to one study about marketing funnels, very, very, very specific uses. There is no single hard and fast rule about what people want. They often will, if they really, really need to do it or they really want to, they'll try harder, they'll fake it, they'll make it up, they will decide they've succeeded when they haven't succeeded. And if they don't have to, often you will get people rejecting your application on one failure. A huge percentage of people will simply not finish using your app if you annoy them with difficult installs or give them an app tour. They'll go, oh, I don't have time for that, skip out of it, and never come back. So that's a one-click failure. So yeah, it varies very, 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 very broadly, and if you're looking for that kind of thing, you can tell your marketing guys, nah, there's no good guidelines, and we need to think about our users, their needs, and actually go out and test it and find out what their tolerance is.
Do you find that people use a different device for different functions, like a tablet for reading or a phone for maps? How can responsive design integrate these principles of touch that you're talking about?
Yeah, yes, I find that the things that other people have found are true. There's a lovely study, this is now getting a couple years old, the multi-device world. It was published by Google. I have a link for it somewhere in that forth.com/touch page. There's about 200 references to articles. In there somewhere should be a link to this one, which is something like the multi-device world. I can't remember the exact name. And there's a lovely little study Google did where they went into people's homes and watched how they use stuff. And it was all about kind of codifying that whole second or third screening thing you get where people will watch TV and use a tablet or phone or something. But it extended. So people would, for example, very frequently do stuff like browse for products to purchase on Amazon on their phone, and then share it with somebody else who would look at it on their phone or their tablet, but then maybe transact on a tablet or desktop computer because it was easier to type credit card numbers, or otherwise they needed the space to see the cart or something like that. So there are various contextual and trust-based reasons people switch devices occasionally. Oh, there's a second part to it. I can't remember. Oh, responsive, I think, is a massively overused term and technology. If we're talking web only, then I strongly prefer adaptive, and I think you should look that up. Trying to think if I have a good free article about it. But anyway, if you look up the responsive versus adaptive, you'll find some good discussions of it. And once you start paying attention to that, you notice that, say, Amazon, many of these other people who are very successful in the field use adaptive designs. They use a completely different website template to load custom content depending on what device class you're using. Now, of course, it's all in the same brand, style, and the same basic functionality and stuff, but it gives you a lot more useful capabilities. Core to that, though, isn't the responsive adaptive part. It's thinking about user context and sessions and identity and preservation of information, where you don't just allow them to share and link and go find the same information, but when you identify them from sign-on or cookie behavior or whatever, you let them resume immediately at the same place. You give them reminders. Hey, you were last here shopping for this. Do you want to see that again? You can definitely encourage that kind of behavior, and that's not very hard to do, so when we see it fail, it's very, very sad. I'll just use an example the other day, even on one device, where I was trying to buy tickets from, and I'll be mean to them, the Alamo Draft House, and it took so long to enter my credit card information on the phone because they made it hard to do that it timed out. And when you press the button to continue, it took me back to the corporate page. It forgot not just what I was looking at, but even what city I was located in. So I had to tell them everything from scratch, which means to the previous question, I gave up. I waited until I got home and could use a computer to transact because their mobile tool was so terribly terrible. I knew it would probably fail the second time. So that's your short answer for the thing. Is you can think again about your context and how people are going to work with your tool in reality. Do a task mapping type thing. Draw little sketches of the people walking through and figure out where are the edge points and what will they want to do when they resume with your service on another device. So what technology can you offer them to make it seamless and easier?
Can you talk more about the accessibility standards that you mentioned for people with impaired vision?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part. The accessibility standards and then what?
That you mentioned for people with impaired vision.
I have lots and lots and lots of stuff about that somewhere else. So many things to cover with that. One thing that I mentioned I didn't go into enough detail of, I said that I like to pretend that every single user is colorblind and nearsighted. And that means never build the site with too small a type and assume people will punch it up, but always build it larger because everybody can read larger sizes. The very few people who are 13-year-old hacker nerds and want a tiny type will go into their phone and change the sizes. The other part is the color blindness, though. We use the phones in odd environments. We don't set up our computer screens to make sure there's no glare on them. So there's routinely glare and dirt and fingerprint smudges and bad angles. So the phone has often got color shifts or loses a lot of the integrity. So you can't see colors and rely on them. So therefore we design everything as though every user is colorblind. What else? There's many topics we get into about motion and difficulty like that. That gets most of them, though. I know one. When I said the sizing, use standard techniques and technologies. Without getting too much into it, people don't like to admit they are handicapped, let's call it. And, so if you build a control on the edge of your web page that says make larger text or go into accessible mode, no one will ever use it. But they might customize their phone for the most comfortable viewing, not based on accessibility viewing, just in general. Oh, I would like slightly larger type because it makes it easier to read. And if your app or website is properly coded so it inherits the type sizes, then they can read that the same way they can the rest of the phone, and they're all wonderful and happy. So there are a bunch of those inheritance techniques you can use to make sure that it's intrinsically accessible.
What is your opinion on the integration of haptics in mobile devices? Should there be other considerations physiologically when designing apps and sites?
I have not thought about those a lot lately because the support is poor down to you as an end, especially on the web side of things. I think, yeah, that tactile feedback, that vibratory feedback is incredibly cool and useful, and the toolkits we have available to us, at least last I checked, but you can, like I said, tweet or email at me if I'm wrong, are very poor and they give us very little to go off of. For example, when I do see vibratory feedback used extensively, for example, to reinforce a message, it's very similar to the beep you get from the PIN pad terminal when you're checking out with a credit card or your chip card, where it beeps the same every time. You can't tell the difference between an error, and they all sound like error beeps. So we're getting very poor feedback from it. There are lots and lots of really cool capabilities. Come to think of it, I think I wrote about this in the Designing Mobile Interfaces book, so you can see some of what I thought a few years ago there, where you can do really cool things with haptics, like it doesn't just have to vibrate, but it can vibrate with tonal qualities. You can essentially provide audio levels of information through vibratory feedback things, and therefore you can at the very least send happy sounds versus unhappy sounds. You can make key clicks that aren't just a random vibration, but that kind of feel like a key click, so that you can differentiate your key click haptics from, oh, hey, pay attention to me as a dialogue and stuff. The capabilities are really, really, really cool here, and it was a super neat thing that was going to be the next big deal in 5 or 10 years ago, but it seems to have stalled out, like I said, with the lack of supporting tools for it. I would love to see W3C support that heavily, and then all the browsers work with it, for example, so that we can get it into web as well, because having it only work difficultly on the app side means it doesn't get the exposure it needs. But if I missed the point of your question, like I said, bug me more later.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks everyone for attending our webinar, Designed for Fingers, Touch, and People. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. If you want to be considered as a speaker for a future webinar, please send your information and at least 3 potential topics. On behalf of Bestica and our presenter, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.